Okay, so let's start talking about the chapter 6. Chapter 6 talks about what? Bones and the skeletal tissue. So now, first thing I want you to understand that before you have bone in your body, do you know what did you have? Cartilage, yeah. And do you know where do you have cartilage right now as an adult? Like in your here, right? These are flexible, right? It's not as rigid as your bone, right? So whenever you, before you became, what, like adult, not adult, even long time back, you had started to have the bones. But once upon a time, the whole human skeleton initially consists of just cartilage, which is replaced by bone, except in areas requiring flexibility, right? So those are called skeletal cartilage, made of highly resilient molded cartilage tissue that consists primarily of water, no blood vessels or nerves. So remember, whenever we were talking about the different parts of the bone, then there is a place called perichondrium. What is that perichondrium? This is the layer of the dense connective tissue surrounding cartilage like a girdle. So helps cartilage resist outward expansion, contain blood vessels for nutrient delivery to cartilage. Cartilage is made up of what type of cell? Chondrocyte cells encased in the small cavity. What is the name of that cavity? Lacuna, within jelly-like extracellular matrix. And how many different type of the cartilage we have already? You know, hyaline cartilage, and then you have the elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage. So when we say hyaline cartilage, what is the function of the hyaline cartilage? Provide the support, flexibility and resilience, most abundant type. Okay, hyaline cartilage you find the most in the articular joint, costal ribs, respiratory and nasal cartilage, right? In your nasal cartilage. What about the elastic cartilage? You only find them in your external ear and the epiglottis. What about the fibrocartilage? These are the thick collagen fibers and has great tensile strength, because collagen fiber provides the what? Tensile strength. So where do you find the fibrocartilage? Menisci of the knee, vertebral disc, pubic symphysis, right? Okay. So one thing I want you to understand right here is that once upon a time, all of your skeleton was made up of the cartilage, and they had to grow. So they had to grow in width. If they had to grow in width, we call it appositional growth. If they had to grow in length, we call it what? Interstitial growth. So what do we mean by the appositional growth, which is actually in width? Cartilage forming cells in perichondrium secrete matrix against the external surface of existing cartilage, and new matrix laid down on surface of the cartilage. That is how they grow in width. What about the interstitial grow in length? So you have the chondrocytes within the lacunae divide and secrete new matrix expanding cartilage from within, and new matrix made within the cartilage. So basically during the interstitial growth you are dividing the chondrocyte, but during the appositional growth you are not really messing up with the chondrocyte. Instead what you are doing, cartilage forming cells in the perichondrium secrete the matrix against the external surface of the existing cartilage. Okay, so everyone knows about some function of the skeleton and bone, right? Everyone knows about the support, protection, movement, right? But do you know that your bone also store mineral and the growth factor? Yeah, like calcium and phosphorus and growth factor reservoir. What about the blood cell formation? Do you know that your bone marrow in your bone actually the place where you have the blood cell formation, hematopoiesis, right? What about the storage? So do you remember that long bone? Inside the long bone, you have all this what? Medullary cavity. There is a cavity inside, right? That cavity has the yellow bone marrow, which also store the what? Fat. And also, they actually secrete hormone too. The name of the hormone is osteocalcin. What is the name of the hormone? Osteocalcin. So you can actually think about your bone as an endocrine, the part of your endocrine system too. Osteocalcin secreted by the bone helps to regulate insulin secretion, your glucose level, and the metabolism. So can you guys tell me one more time what are the functions of the bone? First of all, support, protection, movement. What type of the mineral storage? Calcium, phosphorus. And what about the what? Bone cell formation. What is the name of the bone cell formation process? Hematopoiesis. Which part of the bone actually produces? Which part of the bone actually produces the what? Hematopoiesis. Your red bone marrow. Okay. And also they store fat. They also store what? Fat. The most important one, which probably nobody even think about, is what? They also secrete hormone called osteocalcin. That hormone regulates so many things in your body, including insulin secretion, glucose level, and the metabolism. Do you know that you have 206 bones in your body? Everyone knows that. Very good. So now let's talk about all of these 206 bones can be divided into two groups. Number one is the what? Axial skeleton in what? In blue. Your skull, your ribs, rib cage, sternum, vertebral column. These are all the part of the what? Your axial skeleton. Your shoulder bone though and your hip bone, it looks like they are part of the axial skeleton, but they are not. They are part of the what? Appendicular skeleton. Okay. So do you remember we did talk about what? Different types of the bones in your body, right? What are the four different types of the bone do you find in our body? Flat bone. Can you give me some example of the flat bone? Sternum and the all of the what? All of your bones in the skull, right? Yeah. Like for example, your frontal, temporal, right? All of them. Occipital, all of them. Okay, very good. I did ask question about that in your exam today. So which one is the long bone? If they are longer than their width, we call it long bone. When we say long bone, what are the example of long bone? Your humerus, radioulna, not carpal but metacarpal, phalanges, femur, tibia fibula, what? Tarsal, metatarsal, right? Phalanges. What about this small one? The one has the what? Same length and the width. What do we call that one? Short bone. Example is tarsal, carpal, right? Okay. So what about the irregular bone? Which one is the irregular bone? All of your vertebra, right? These are the irregular bone. Does anybody remember about the name of this bone on the knee? Patella. What type of bone is this one? Huh? It's different. What type of bone is that? Everyone forgot. I talked about it. The patella is what type of bone? Sesamoid. Who said that? Sesamoid bone. Yeah, this is sesamoid bone. I asked that question too in your exam today. Okay? So make sure you know it. Don't write short bone. You're wrong. Okay. So now let's talk about the bone structure. Bone structure. So bone structure you can see with your naked eye. We call it gross anatomy. You need the microscope to see some of the structure. You call it microscopic anatomy. And then definitely there are so much of what chemical properties and chemical composition of the bone that we have to learn as well, right? Okay. So now let's start with the gross anatomy. So we know that we have two different types of the bone. Do you know we have two different types of the bone? Compact bone and the spongy bone. How do they look different from each other? Compact bone has all the osteocyte and then very rigid, right? But if you look at the spongy bone though, they do not have the what osteocyte. Instead, they have all the honeycomb of small needle-like flat pieces of the bone called the trabeculae. What do you call it? Trabeculae. Open space between trabeculae are filled with the red or yellow bone marrow. So now we know that we have different types of the bone in our body. If you look at the short bone, your short bone are actually a sandwich. It's like a what? Sandwich. When we say sandwich, what do we mean by that? It means your short bone and flat bone, these are all what? Like a sandwich. That means you have compact bone like the what? Bread, and like the meat inside you have the spongy bone. That is the what? Structure, the sandwich structure of your bone. And then you have the periosteum covers outside of the compact bone, and endosteum cover inside portion of the bone. Remember I talked about the sandwich. When you look at the sandwich, you have this compact bone right here, right? You have the compact bone right here, and then you have all this what? Honeycomb like structure, spongy bone right here. And outside of the compact bone you have the what? Perichondrium. And inside you have the what? Periosteum and endosteum, right? Periosteum and endosteum. So periosteum covers the outside of the compact bone, and endosteum covers the inside portion of the compact bone. So bone marrow is scattered throughout the spongy bone, no defined marrow cavity. Hyaline cartilage covers area of the bone that is part of the movable joint. So a lot of the time, like all the movable joints on top of the bone, you have a what? You have a hyaline cartilage, right? Like for example, this bone right here, on top of the bone you have the hyaline cartilage. Okay, so who remembers about all this? Epiphysis, diaphysis, and medullary cavity. So when you look at the bone, what do you see? Something like this. So you have this end. What is the name of this end? The name of this end are epiphysis, and this part right here is called the diaphysis, right? This epiphysis on top we call it proximal epiphysis. This one is called the what? Distal epiphysis. And in between the epiphysis, what do you have? You have the diaphysis, and in the diaphysis you have the compact bone, then you have the spongy bone, then you have the cavity. This cavity is called the medullary cavity. What do you call it? Medullary cavity. You have question about all this as well in your exam today, so make sure you remember the name as well. So what do you call this? The top portion? Proximal epiphysis, distal epiphysis, and this right here in the middle, diaphysis. The cavity inside, what do you call this cavity? Medullary cavity. So the diaphysis is elongated, usually cylindrical shaft, provides leverage and weight support. Compact bone with spongy bone extending inward. And what about the medullary cavity? Hollow cylindrical space within the diaphysis, In the children, your medullary cavity is filled up with the red bone marrow, but when we become adult, it turns into yellow bone marrow. Have you ever eaten a long bone of any large animal? No, never? You did? So if you did, then you saw all those bone marrow with all those fat inside the medullary cavity. You have seen that? No? Okay. You did that? Okay. Good. So now we know about the epiphysis. When we say epiphysis, what do we mean by that? The end of the long bone, right? The one on the top, proximal epiphysis. The one on the bottom, we call it distal epiphysis, composed of outer thin layer of compact bone and inner region of the spongy bone. An articular cartilage covers the joint surface. Thin layer of hyaline cartilage reduces friction and absorbs shock in movable joints. That is why you have a layer of articular cartilage on top of the long bone. Now let's talk about the very important part, which is called the, you have the epiphysis, you have the diaphysis. In between the epiphysis and diaphysis, you have the what? Metaphysis. What do you have? Metaphysis. So whenever you were growing taller, how you became taller? The way you became taller is by the what? By the lengthening of all these long bone. That lengthening is happening in the metaphysis. There is a place in the metaphysis, we call it growth plate, which is actually a thin layer of the hyaline cartilage, provides for the lengthwise bone growth. Whenever we become adult, that growth plate turns into epiphyseal line. Whenever it turns into epiphyseal line, we do not grow taller anymore. Okay, we stop growing taller. So okay, so now let's talk about we know all this, all the structure, right? I'm asking you, you have to tell me the on top of this blue part, what is the name of this blue part? Articular cartilage, made up of the hyaline cartilage, right? And what is this part right here? Proximal epiphysis. This part right here, diaphysis. This one right here, distal epiphysis. The cavity inside, okay, medullary cavity. Now you also have to tell me that the sandwich, how do they make the sandwich? You have the compact bone, then spongy bone. Outside the compact bone, you have the, this is on top actually. But if you are thinking about like for example right here, this is the what? Peristeum, and this one right here, endosteum. So now let's talk about the periosteum, and the endosteum. So when we say periosteum, what do we mean by that? White double layered membrane that covers external surfaces except the joints. So they have the fibrous layer and osteogenic layer. When we say fibrous layer, that what does that mean? Outer layer consisting of dense irregular connective tissue consisting of Sharpie's fiber that occurs secured to the bone matrix. Then they also have a what? Osteogenic layer. That is the layer which produces the what? Osteogenic stem cell. Inner layer of the budding bone contains primitive osteogenic stem cell that give rise to most of the bone cells. So contains many nerve fibers and blood vessels that continue onto the shaft through nutrient foramen opening, anchoring points for tendons and the ligaments. Now what about the endosteum, which is inside your what? Compact bone. What do you call that one? Endosteum. What is that? It is a delicate connective tissue membrane covering internal bone surface, covers trabeculae of the spongy bone, and lines canals that pass through the compact bone. Like periosteum contain the osteogenic stem cell that can differentiate into other cells. So do you know that your bone actually what? Regenerate. You actually do what? Regenerate your bone every 2 to 3 years. You actually replace all of your bone. Do you know that? So you are breaking your bone, you are making your bone. Okay. So whenever you are breaking more bone than you make, that's when you have the what? Osteoporosis. It happens when we grow older. But whenever we are growing, we are making more bone than breaking. That is why we have growth, right? So now I want you to understand one thing right here, that growth, that new bone formation is happening from the osteogenic cell, from the endosteum and the periosteum. Now let's talk about the red marrow. Why red marrow is so important? Because these are the marrow which give rise to all the blood cells in our body, which is responsible for the hematopoiesis. So red marrow is found within the trabecular cavities of spongy bone and dipole of flat bone such as sternum. In newborn, medullary cavities and all spongy bone contain red marrow. In adult, red marrow is located in head of the femur and humerus, but most active areas of the hematopoiesis are the flat bone dipole and some irregular bone like hip bone. Actually, hip bone produces the most amount. Yellow marrow can convert to red if person becomes anemic, right? If we become anemic, we need more blood cell formation. That's when what happens, your yellow bone marrow can turn into red bone marrow. Okay, who remembers about all the bone what marking? If you have any hole, what do you call the hole? Foramen, right? And if you have any right ridge, narrow ridge, you call it crest. And if you have the what narrow ridge on the long bone, you call it line. And then what about the what spinous process, right? Spine. And then what about, let's look at this one right here. So they can also have fossa. When we say fossa, what do we mean by that? All this basin like structure, right? Okay. So foramen is always what? Whole, right? What about the condyle? It's like the rounded articular projection, right? Rounded articular projection. So when we say groove, furrow, and when we say fissure, it's also a opening, right? Okay, so unfortunately you have to become more familiar by actually looking at the bone and trying to identify their different parts of the what bone. Okay, I think you have done that enough in the lab last week. What do you think? Yeah. Yep. No, you haven't done that enough. Why? Okay, so what are some general functions of the bone? Fat storage, mineral storage, support movement, mineral storage, huh? Protection, hematopoiesis, huh? Hormone production. What is the name of the hormone? Osteocalcin. Very good. And what are the minerals they store? Calcium, phosphorus, right? Okay. What else? Fat storage. Did you tell me fat storage? Yeah. Okay, good. So what type of bones have a length nearly equal to their width? Short bone, yeah. What portion of the bone contains the epiphyseal plates? Is the epiphyseal line or epiphyseal growth in the metaphysis, right? So where is red bone marrow found in the adult skeleton? In the spongy bone. What is the process of blood cell formation called? Hematopoiesis. Okay, very good. Okay, so now let's talk about 5 different types of the bone cell. Okay, do you remember the difference between the site and the blast? When we say osteoblast, what do we mean by that? Immature developing cell. When we say osteocyte, mature cell. Okay, so when we say osteogenic cell, they are the stem cell which can give rise to the what? Osteocyte, right? And then those bone lining cell in the periosteum and endosteum, right? And then what about the osteoclast? That is the cell actually responsible for what? Breakdown, bone resorption. Okay, all of these are responsible for making bone. This one is what? Responsible for breaking bone, bone resorption. Okay, so the first one is the what? Osteogenic cell, also called the osteoprogenitor cell, mitotically active stem cell in the periosteum and endosteum. When stimulated, they differentiate into osteoblast or bone lining cell. Some remain as osteogenic stem cells. So they are basically the stem cell which give rise to the osteoblast, right? Okay, then when you have osteoblast, what does that mean? They are immature developing cells. So they are the bone forming cell, but they secrete unmineralized bone matrix called the osteoid. Osteoid is made up of collagen and calcium binding protein. Collagen makes up 90% of the bone protein, and osteoblasts are actively mitotic. So now after your osteogenic cell produce osteoblast, then osteoblast will turn into what? Osteocyte, which is the mature bone cell in the lacunae that no longer divide, maintain bone matrix and act as stress or strain sensor, respond to mechanical stimuli such as increased force on bone or weightlessness, communicate information to the osteoblast and osteoclast, so bone remodeling can occur. So as you can see, you have your osteoblast will turn into what? Osteocyte. But osteoclast look very different because this osteoclast has a different function. We will talk about it. But before that, let's talk about the bone lining cell. Right, like few slides back, we did talk about the cells in the periosteum and the endosteum. These are the bone lining cell. So the flat cells on the bone surface believed to also help maintain the matrix. On external bone surface, lining cells are called periosteal cell. On internal surface, they are called endosteal cell. They do have a lot of osteogenic cell to give rise to what? Osteocyte. Now let's talk about the osteoclast. When you see the osteoclast, they are very different from the osteoblast and the osteoclast. They have a lot of what? Lot of folds in the surface to increase the surface area. As I told you, what is the function of the osteoclast? Breakdown of the bone, derived from same hematopoietic stem cells that become macrophages. Giant multinucleate cells function in the bone resorption. When active cells are located in depression called the resorption base. Cells have ruffled borders, as you can see right here, that serve to increase the surface area for enzyme degradation of the bone. Also helps seal off the area from the surrounding matrix. So one more time, how many bone cells we have in our body? 5. Number 1 is the stem cell. What is the name of that? Osteoprogenitor cell or osteogenic cell. And then osteogenic cell produces osteoblast, which is developing and produce what? Secrete osteoid, right? And give rise to osteocyte. And when we say osteocyte, they are the mature bone cell present stays in the lacuna. And then you have the bone lining cell, which are present in the periosteum and endosteum, produces the what? Bone cell. And then who is responsible for breaking down the bone? Osteoclast, right? Okay. So now let's talk about the microscopic anatomy. So when you look at the microscopic anatomy, I did ask a lot of question about that, so make sure you follow. Okay. So now when you look at the compact bone, also called the lamellar bone, have osteon. When we say osteon, what do we mean by that? This whole circle right here you get to see, this is called the osteon. What do you call this whole circle? Osteon. And then who remembers about the canals and canaliculi? So they have this central canal which is getting all the blood supply. And what about the canaliculi? It's what? Do you remember that example I gave you? That you were sitting and studying in your bedroom, your mom cooked in the kitchen, which is central canal. Now you are staying in the bedroom, which is osteocyte in the lacuna. So how do you send the food from the kitchen to the lacuna, central canal to the lacuna? How do you do it? You do it through the canaliculi. You do it through the what? Canaliculi. That alley between the what? Your central canal and the what? Central canal and the lacunae. Okay. Who remember about the interstitial and the circumferential lamella? Interstitial lamella. So these, they have lamella right here. These are the also lamella. The lamella which are part of the what? Osteon, we call it concentric lamella. The lamella which are not part of the osteon, we call them interstitial lamella. And the lamella which are close to the periosteum right here, these are called the circumferential lamella. Okay, so everyone knows about the osteon. So when we say osteon, that is basically the structural unit of the compact bone. Consists of an elongated cylinder that runs parallel to long axis of the bone. Act as a tiny weight bearing pillars. An osteon cylinder consists of several rings of the bone matrix called lamella. Lamella contain collagen fiber that run in different direction in adjacent ring, withstand stress and resist twisting. Bone salts are found between the collagen fiber. And I did talk about the canals and the canaliculi already. You have the canals right here, and canaliculi is basically the what? The connection between the canals and the osteon, right? Not osteon, osteocyte. Okay. What about the lacunae and the canaliculi? Lacunae is the house of the osteocyte, right? And we did talk about the canaliculi. I'm not saying that again. So we did talk about the interstitial lamella and the circumferential lamella already. What is the circumferential lamella? This right here, right? The one with the periosteum. And circumferential lamella is the one with the periosteum. Interstitial lamella, one with the what? Not the part of osteon, but in between the osteon. Okay, so now let's talk about the spongy bone. Spongy bone does not have any osteon. Who has osteon? Compact bone. The structural unit of the compact bone is the what? Osteon. But spongy bone does not have any what? Osteon. Appears poorly organized but is actually organized along lines of the stress to help bone resist any stress. Trabeculae, like cables on a suspension bridge, confer strength to bone. No osteons are present, but trabeculae do contain irregularly arranged lamella and osteocyte interconnected by the canaliculi. Capillaries in endosteum supply the nutrients. Okay, so chemical composition of the bone. Bone is made up of the organic and inorganic components. As I told you, one of the main function of your osteoblast is to what? Secrete osteoid. What is this osteoid made up of? Your osteoid, which makes up 1/3 of the organic bone matrix, is secreted by the osteoblast, consists of ground substances and collagen fiber. which contribute to high tensile strength and flexibility of the bone. So what is that inorganic components? The inorganic components together is called hydroxyapatites. Hydroxyapatites make up 65% of the bone by mass, consist mainly of tiny calcium phosphate crystals in and around the collagen fiber, responsible for hardness and resistance to the compression. Okay, so what is the function of an osteoblast and osteoclast? Osteoblast function, secreting. Osteoblast, what is the function of osteoblast? Osteoblast function, I just said today, huh? Bone formation, yeah, bone formation, but what do they also do? Secrete osteoid, yeah. And what about the osteoclast? Break down the bone or bone resorption. What is the central part of the osteon called? Central canal. And what is found in there? Blood supply. What organic substance compose the bone matrix? What is the name? Hydroxyapatite. What inorganic substance? When we say organic substance, actually that's not, organic substance is your osteoid, inorganic is your what? Hydroxyapatite. Okay, so I'm gonna stop it right here, and then when we come back on next Saturday, we are gonna complete this chapter, and then we are gonna also talk about the next chapters on that day.